I clearly remember the freezing chill in our Denver living room the night Julian spoke the words that ended our marriage. He expected me to cry or shrink away like always. He had no idea his cruelty just handed me the perfect blueprint to destroy his pride. I did not get angry. I became absolutely silent. From that profound silence, I built a brilliant career and pushed him straight into the abyss he dug for himself. Hello to the wonderful audience of Violet Revenge Stories. Our channel has unfortunately been demonetized by YouTube and left without an operating budget. So if you enjoy the story today, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our hardworking staff can afford their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments section of this video. My name is Alyssa Stone, and this is my story. The winter winds sweeping down from the mountains had turned our Denver neighborhood into a frozen wasteland, but the chill inside our living room was far more piercing than the weather outside. It was a Tuesday evening, a mundane and bone-chilling end to a grueling 12-hour shift at Zenith Logistics. My feet throbbed inside my boots, and my shoulders carried the invisible, crushing weight of endless inventory reports, delayed shipping schedules, and the relentless demands of middle management who never seemed to be satisfied. I was pouring every ounce of my energy into that company just to keep our household afloat. Yet the house I returned to offered absolutely no sanctuary. The air inside was quiet. Save for the muffled roars of a sporting event playing on the television and the steady clinking of ice against crystal. I stood at the kitchen sink, my hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing the remnants of a dinner I had rushed home to cook. The steam rising from the basin did nothing to warm the profound sense of isolation that had settled deep into my bones over the past few years. Across the open floor plan, Julian was sprawled on the expensive leather sofa we had purchased during our first year of marriage. Back when things actually felt hopeful, he was nursing his third glass of imported liquor, completely absorbed in the glowing screen, entirely indifferent to the fact that I had barely sat down since 6 o'clock that morning. I wiped my hands on a frayed dish towel, taking a deep breath, preparing to ask him if he wanted anything else before I finally went to rest. But as I turned around, I caught him staring at me. It was not a look of affection, nor even casual observation. His gaze was heavy, deliberate, and drenched in a visceral contempt that made my stomach knot. His eyes raked over my practical work clothes, my messy hair pulled back into a tired knot, and the damp towel still clutched in my hands. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until he finally spoke. "Every time I look at you, I honestly ask myself why I ever chose you," he said. His voice was flat, completely devoid of any heat or sudden anger. It was a cold, calculated statement of fact, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who knew exactly how much power he held over me. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. I could have married a real partner, someone ambitious, someone who actually built something with her life, a successful woman who commands respect in the real world. Instead, I am stuck looking at a glorified warehouse clerk scrubbing plates. For years, those words would have been the ultimate trigger. The old me would have crumpled instantly. I would have felt the familiar hot sting of tears welling in my eyes. I would have rushed over to the sofa, my voice trembling, apologizing for not being enough, begging him to tell me what I could do to make him proud of me. I would have spent the next 2 weeks shrinking myself, walking on eggshells, trying desperately to win back the approval of a man who despised my very existence. But that night, something inside me broke. The frantic, anxious energy that usually flooded my chest simply vanished, replaced by an absolute, terrifying stillness. The emotional tether that had kept me bound to his validation snapped cleanly in half. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to scream. I just saw him for exactly what he was, an arrogant, manipulative man sitting on a couch, trying to tear me down to make himself feel massive. I walked slowly from the kitchen into the living room, stopping just a few feet away from where he lounged. I looked him dead in the eyes. I kept my face entirely impassive, letting the silence stretch until I saw a flicker of genuine unease cross his features. "You are right," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. Julian blinked, clearly taken aback. He shifted his weight, his brow furrowing in confusion. This was not the script. This was not the reaction he demanded. He needed my tears to feed his ego, and my calm agreement threw him entirely off balance. Frantic to reclaim the upper hand, he released a grating, scornful laugh, straining to sink the blade further. "Of course I am right," he sneered, leaning forward so the overhead light caught the hard lines of his face. "Look at yourself. You are pushing papers at Zenith Logistics for absolute pennies. It is pathetic. Your job is a trivial, dead-end joke. Just like your ambition. You bring absolutely nothing of value to this table." He waited for the blow to land. He waited for me to shatter. I simply stared at him, absorbing the insults, not as wounds, but as information. He was handing me the key to my own cage, showing me exactly how thoroughly he underestimated my intelligence, without uttering another syllable. I turned my back on him and walked straight down the hallway toward the master bedroom. I heard him mutter a curse under his breath, frustrated that his favorite punching bag had refused to play the game, but I did not even break my stride. I closed the bedroom door behind me and locked it with a quiet, satisfying click. The room was cast in shadows, but my mind had never been clearer. I walked over to my desk, opened my computer, and watched the screen flare to life. The glow illuminated my face in the dark. I opened a blank spreadsheet and a secure web browser. The time for being a submissive, accommodating, broken wife was officially over. That night, under the quiet hum of the machine, I began to draft an airtight, independent financial plan. I started mapping out every single dollar I earned, every asset we shared under the law, and every strategic step I needed to take to sever my financial dependence on him. Julian wanted a successful, ruthless woman who commanded respect. I was going to give him exactly that, and the lesson was going to cost him everything. When the sun crested the horizon the following morning, the atmosphere in the house felt entirely different to me, even if the man snoring loudly down the hall remained oblivious. I rose at 5 o'clock, long before my usual alarm. I did not tiptoe. I walked to the kitchen and made a single cup of coffee, strictly for myself. Precisely at 6:30, Julian shuffled out of the master suite, rubbing his eyes and expecting his usual morning service. He acted as though his venomous speech from the night before was nothing more than a passing breeze. "Where is my breakfast, Alyssa? And my blue dress shirt is not ironed," he demanded, his voice thick with sleep and entitlement. I did not look up from my laptop. I simply packed my leather tote, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. On the pristine granite counter, I left a plain white index card with a brief, unambiguous message. "I am done managing your life. You are a grown man. Handle your own breakfast and iron your own clothes." I heard his voice rise in indignation as the front door clicked shut behind me. But his anger was no longer my burden to bear. By the time I arrived at the Zenith Logistics headquarters, the corporate machinery was just waking up. I marched straight into the regional director's office before he even had time to take off his coat. For years, I had flown under the radar, doing my job efficiently, but never stepping into the line of fire. That ended today. I volunteered for the catastrophic supply chain restructuring project that had been hemorrhaging money for 8 months. It was a logistical nightmare involving 3 different international ports and a mountain of backlogged inventory. Every senior manager had dodged it, knowing it was a career killer. The director looked at me as if I had lost my mind, but he handed over the files anyway. I dove into the data with a clinical, predatory focus. I stayed at the office until 9 or 10 o'clock almost every night, fueled by black coffee and the icy determination to build an undeniable fortress of personal value. I restructured vendor contracts, identified massive inefficiencies in our freight routes, and began presenting weekly turnaround reports directly to the executive board. They stopped seeing me as a floor supervisor and started recognizing me as a formidable strategist capable of saving the company millions of dollars. As my professional capital surged, my investigative work into my personal finances yielded a staggering revelation. It happened on a random Thursday afternoon while I was scanning our joint banking statements for discrepancies. My heart flatlined when I uncovered a massive, unauthorized withdrawal history tied to the equity of our home. Julian had secretly taken out a second mortgage on our shared house, leveraging the roof over our heads to funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars into a highly volatile, speculative tech startup. He had actually forged my initials on the preliminary paperwork. The sheer audacity of his betrayal would have devastated the old Alyssa. The new Alyssa simply printed the documents, categorized them into a neat manila folder, and made a quiet phone call during my lunch break. I hired the most ruthless, high-profile family law attorney in the city. We met in a sterile, glass-walled conference room high above downtown Denver. I did not shed a single tear. I laid the forged documents on the mahogany table. "Sever every financial tie between this man and me," I instructed my lawyer smoothly. "I want a legal mechanism that isolates his debts and protects my rapidly growing corporate assets." We began drafting an ironclad post-nuptial agreement masked as a routine liability waiver, meticulously designed to push the sole burden of that ruinous mortgage squarely onto his shoulders. Meanwhile, Julian was spiraling into a pathetic display of dominance, entirely blind to the invisible noose tightening around his neck. Because I was working so many late hours at Zenith Logistics, he assumed I was avoiding him out of pure humiliation. He firmly believed he still held the psychological upper hand. To punish my newfound defiance and my refusal to act as his maid, he escalated his cruelty to a grotesque level. He started bringing strange women into our home on the nights he knew I was stuck at the office. I would return close to midnight and find 2 crystal wine glasses in the sink, unfamiliar heavy perfume lingering in the hallway, and sometimes a breathless giggle echoing from behind the closed door of the guest bedroom. He wanted me to confront him. He desperately needed me to scream, to break down, to bang on the door and fight for his pathetic affections so he could feel like a king holding court. He wanted to break my spirit entirely. He had no idea that I was not reacting because I was the one directing the play. Weeks before his first mistress ever crossed our threshold, I had hired a discreet private security firm to install state-of-the-art, motion-activated hidden cameras in every common area and hallway of the house. I was not a jealous wife looking for emotional closure. I was a tactician gathering absolute, irrefutable legal leverage. Every late-night rendezvous, every stolen kiss near the entryway, and every damning conversation was being recorded in ultra-high definition, time-stamped, and uploaded directly to a secure cloud server managed by my attorney. Julian thought he was breaking my heart and showing me my place in the dirt. In reality, he was blindly, meticulously building the exact evidentiary arsenal I needed to completely obliterate him in divorce court. By the time the 3rd month rolled around, the grueling, 60-hour work weeks I had invested at Zenith Logistics finally culminated in a massive, undeniable breakthrough. The international supply chain crisis I had volunteered to take over was no longer just stabilized. I had completely revolutionized our entire freight network. My relentless negotiation tactics, coupled with countless late-night strategy sessions, paid off spectacularly when I secured an exclusive multi-year logistics contract with one of the largest retail conglomerates in North America. We were talking about an agreement worth tens of millions of dollars over its lifespan, a staggering figure that single-handedly shifted our regional division from a concerning deficit into unprecedented, record-breaking profitability. The impact within the corporate hierarchy was immediate and seismic. On a crisp, rainy Tuesday morning, I was summoned directly to the executive penthouse suite by the chief executive officer himself. He did not mince words, nor did he offer empty corporate platitudes. He bluntly acknowledged that I had salvaged a catastrophic project that every other senior manager in the building had cowardly run away from. Right there, in his sprawling, glass-walled office overlooking the gray Denver skyline, he personally promoted me to the position of Regional Vice President of Operations. The compensation package he slid across the polished mahogany desk was nothing short of life-changing. My base salary was instantly multiplied by 3, accompanied by a generous allocation of company stock options that vested immediately upon signing. I walked into that boardroom as a hardworking, easily ignored floor supervisor, and I walked out as a high-ranking corporate executive with a financial portfolio that secured my absolute independence forever. Yet, the moment I left the towering glass headquarters each evening, a bizarre and meticulously calculated physical transformation took place. I categorically refused to let Julian catch even a single, fleeting glimpse of my newfound power and success. He needed to remain completely submerged in his suffocating delusion of superiority for my ultimate plan to execute flawlessly, to maintain the illusion. I rented a small, secure locker at a high-end fitness club located just 3 blocks from my office, every single day after work. I would lock myself in the dressing room and strip off the sharp, tailored designer blazers and expensive silk blouses that my new executive income easily afforded me. I would carefully wipe the premium makeup from my face, tie my hair back into a messy, unflattering knot, and change back into the faded, oversized sweaters and worn-out slacks that Julian openly despised. I deliberately manufactured the appearance of a woman who was exhausted, unremarkable, and utterly defeated by life before I ever turned the key in our front door. While my professional and financial trajectory was soaring straight upward into the stratosphere, Julian's precarious house of cards was rapidly collapsing under the crushing weight of his own unchecked arrogance. The high-risk technology startup he had illegally funneled our home equity into was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming, unstoppable rate. The brilliant software developers he constantly bragged about to his friends had jumped ship after their paychecks bounced, and his supposedly revolutionary product was being mercilessly crushed by established, well-funded competitors. As his financial reality darkened into a nightmare, his behavior at home became increasingly erratic, hostile, and desperate. The smug, quiet contempt he used to display toward me morphed into loud, frantic, unpredictable rage. He paced the hardwood floors of our living room until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, nursing cheap, generic whiskey because he could no longer afford his beloved imported brands. To cope with the sheer magnitude of his monumental failure, Julian did exactly what weak, narcissistic men always do. He forcefully projected every ounce of his rising panic onto me. He started picking vicious, screaming fights over the most ridiculous, trivial things imaginable. If there was a speck of dust on the hallway baseboards, he would scream until his throat was raw that my sheer incompetence was ruining his peace of mind. If I did not have a complicated, hot meal waiting for him the second he demanded it, he would hurl his glass against the kitchen wall, shattering it into 100 pieces, and blame my profound lack of domestic care for his inability to focus on saving his failing business. He constructed a bizarre, twisted narrative where his professional collapse was entirely my fault, because I was not providing a supportive, nurturing environment for his so-called genius to thrive. The absolute boiling point arrived on a bleak Sunday afternoon. I was sitting quietly at the kitchen island, discreetly reviewing a printed spreadsheet of my rapidly growing Zenith stock portfolio, which I swiftly flipped face down the second I heard his heavy, frantic footsteps pounding down the hallway. Julian stormed into the kitchen. A picture of complete unraveling. His eyes were heavily bloodshot. His usually perfect hair was unkempt and greasy, and his breath reeked heavily of stale alcohol, unbrushed teeth, and raw desperation. He slammed both of his hands down on the marble counter, leaning aggressively over me with a look of frantic malice. "I need $50,000 in cash by Friday morning," he demanded, his voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "The server hosting fees are past due. The primary investors are threatening to pull out, and my bridge loan just fell through. You need to go to your miserable little logistics office tomorrow morning and beg your coworkers or your boss for a loan. Tell them it is a life-or-death family emergency. Take out a massive cash advance on your credit cards. I do not care how you get the money, but you are going to get it for me today." I slowly looked up at him, keeping my facial expression perfectly neutral. I did not blink. I did not shrink back. I did not show a single ounce of fear. "No, I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and completely devoid of any empathy whatsoever. I am not borrowing a single dime from anyone for you. Your business is your responsibility. Julian, figure it out yourself. Julian's face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His brain simply could not comprehend the fact that the woman he viewed as a pathetic, insignificant subordinate was casually denying him his final, desperate lifeline. He unleashed a violent, deafening torrent of vicious insults, his voice echoing sharply off the high-vaulted ceilings of the house. "You are entirely useless!" he screamed, the veins in his neck bulging as his face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. "You are a selfish, pathetic, miserable failure. I am out here bleeding every day trying to build an empire, trying to secure a future for us, and you will not even lift a single finger to help me. This is exactly why you will never be anything more than a glorified, brainless secretary. You have absolutely no vision, no loyalty, and no inherent worth. You are going to die broke, bitter, and entirely alone. Alyssa." He violently kicked a bar stool out of his way and stormed out of the house, slamming the heavy mahogany front door so hard that the framed pictures on the hallway wall actually rattled against the plaster. I sat there in the sudden, ringing quiet of the empty kitchen, feeling an overwhelming, intoxicating wave of cold satisfaction wash over my entire body. I slowly reached out and turned my financial spreadsheet right side up, as he tore out of the driveway in his car in a blind, pathetic rage, screaming into the void about my supposed poverty and uselessness. He had absolutely no idea that the liquid balance in my newly established, private bank accounts had already vastly surpassed the absolute highest net worth he had ever achieved in his entire miserable life. The massive executive bonus cleared my private offshore account on a crisp Tuesday morning. It was not merely a standard paycheck, it was an astronomical, life-altering sum, a staggering seven-figure payout reflecting the immense profitability of my newly secured logistics contracts. I did not waste a single moment purchasing designer clothes or flashy jewelry to show off to the world. Instead, I drove straight to the most exclusive, discreet real estate agency located deep in the heart of downtown Denver. Within 48 hours, I had paid in full, in pure cash, for a breathtaking penthouse apartment situated on the 42nd floor of a high-security glass tower. The residence featured spectacular panoramic views of the snow-capped Rocky Mountains, sprawling imported white oak floors, a chef-grade kitchen wrapped in black marble, and an impenetrable fortress of privacy guarded by a 24-hour concierge service. Slowly and methodically, I began the meticulous process of extraction from the toxic wasteland I used to call a home. Every single day before leaving for the office, I would quietly slip one or two irreplaceable personal items into the bottom of my heavy leather work tote. A cherished family photo album, my original birth certificates, the vintage gold watch my late grandfather had gifted me. I relocated the very essence of my existence piece by tiny piece. Julian was so entirely consumed by his own impending doom and chaotic panic that he never even noticed the closets were growing bare, or that my presence in the house was nothing more than a hollow, silent ghost haunting the hallways. While I was quietly building a magnificent sanctuary in the sky, Julian was rapidly suffocating under the crushing weight of his catastrophic financial decisions. His cellular phone rang incessantly with aggressive unknown numbers at all hours of the day and night. Relentless debt collectors and furious private investors were aggressively closing in on him, threatening severe legal action. His back was firmly pinned against a brick wall, forcing him to formulate a desperate, incredibly underhanded strategy to liquidate our shared home and use the remaining equity to save his own miserable skin. Because he still fundamentally viewed me as a gullible, uneducated subordinate, he decided to play a sickeningly sweet and affectionate angle. On a quiet Saturday morning, he walked into the kitchen wearing a soft, apologetic smile that I had not seen on his face in over 4 years. He actually brewed me a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, set it gently on the island, and slid a thick stack of official-looking legal documents across the cold granite surface. He spoke in a gentle, reassuring tone, completely masking the venomous rage from his previous terrifying outbursts. He spun a highly detailed, pathetic lie about how his massive business stress was causing him severe cardiac health issues. He claimed these intricate forms were simply standard, necessary authorizations to significantly upgrade our joint premium health insurance policies. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "This is a vital, urgent step to secure our future health and overall well-being as a unified couple." Alyssa. I looked down at the neatly stacked papers, masterfully feigning an expression of mild confusion and dutiful concern, while my mind operated with the cold, calculated precision of a master diamond cutter. I knew exactly what those specific documents really were. I instantly recognized the standard legal formatting and the subtle boilerplate language of a comprehensive property power of attorney. He was trying to casually trick me into signing away my 50% legal rights to the house so he could unilaterally sell the property, evict me, and abscond with the entire pile of cash. I played my subservient role flawlessly. I gave him a soft, compliant nod, took a sip of the dark coffee, and said, "I just need to take the paperwork to the office on Monday to slowly read through the complicated medical terminology before I sign my name." He eagerly agreed, smiling broadly like a hungry predator, entirely confident that my supposed lack of supreme intelligence would prevent me from understanding the heavy legal jargon. That following afternoon, safely secured behind the locked solid mahogany doors of my executive suite at Zenith Logistics, I executed the most critical, dangerous phase of my entire plan. I took the final signature pages he had specifically provided and seamlessly attached them to a completely different set of heavy legal documents my ruthless attorney had prepared weeks in advance. I completely swapped his treacherous property authorization for a legally binding, ironclad, irrevocable separation agreement coupled tightly with a total debt assumption clause. The new contract explicitly and undeniably stated that Julian willingly accepted 100% of all corporate liabilities, secondary mortgages, and high-interest private loans tied to his name or his failed business, fully and permanently indemnifying me from any and all resulting financial ruin. When I brought the thick folder of documents back home that evening, I casually tossed them onto the polished dining room table next to his dinner plate. I handed him a heavy silver fountain pen and softly said, "I have already highlighted the specific areas where we both need to sign our initials to expedite the medical coverage." His sheer, unadulterated arrogance was his absolute, spectacular undoing. He was so incredibly smug, so entirely convinced of his own superior intellect and my profound, pathetic stupidity, that he did not even bother to read a single paragraph of the revised legal text. He did not check the headers on the top of the pages. He did not read the heavily altered financial stipulations printed right above the signature line. He simply snatched the silver pen from my fingers and hastily scribbled his signature across every single page I pointed to, effectively and legally signing away his entire financial future without a single second of hesitation. A smug, triumphant grin plastered his face as he forcefully snatched the heavy folder back from the table, genuinely thinking he had just secured the ultimate, flawless victory over his foolish wife. I simply smiled back at him with warm, quiet eyes, internally vibrating with the knowledge that I had just handed him a fully loaded weapon aimed directly at his own chest. The final, breathtakingly beautiful piece of the puzzle fell into place entirely by accident, just 2 days later at the busy corporate office. I was sitting at my large desk, conducting a routine, high-level executive review of our third-party vendor contracts for the upcoming fiscal quarter. I was scrolling meticulously through the comprehensive alphabetical list of strategic financial partners that Zenith Logistics retained for aggressive corporate debt recovery and asset liquidation services. My eyes suddenly locked onto a specific corporate entity name, and my blood ran completely cold with pure, unadulterated exhilaration. The notoriously aggressive private collection agency that had been relentlessly hunting Julian down. the very firm violently threatening to seize his assets and completely destroy his life, was not just a random, disconnected company. They were a premier, highly exclusive vendor operating under a massive, highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar service contract directly managed and authorized by my specific operations department at Zenith Logistics. I was not just a passing executive to them. I was their primary, highest-ranking corporate client and their absolute ultimate financial gatekeeper. The profound, poetic irony of the situation washed over me like a freezing bucket of ice water. Julian had spent years screaming in my face, aggressively telling me I was worthless, powerless, and completely insignificant, yet, by a twist of pure, unbelievable corporate fate, I was now sitting at the absolute pinnacle of his command chain. I held the direct, undisputed authority to either extend his payment deadlines with a single phone call or authorize the immediate, merciless seizure of everything he owned. I was no longer just the neglected, obedient wife he despised. I was the silent, invisible architect of his total destruction, holding the absolute power of life and death over his entire financial existence. And the arrogant fool had absolutely no idea the massive hurricane that was about to hit him. The day of absolute reckoning finally arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon. I left the Zenith Logistics headquarters exactly at 5 o'clock. For the very first time in my adult life, I did not point my car toward the suffocating suburban house that had been my emotional prison for so long. Instead, I drove directly to my new sanctuary in the center of the city. When I stepped out of the private elevator and into my 42nd floor penthouse, the profound silence wrapped around me like a heavy silk blanket. There was no yelling, no demanding orders, and no tension thickening the air. I walked into the pristine kitchen, retrieved a heavy crystal glass from the cabinet, and poured myself a generous measure of an expensive deep red vintage wine. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city of Denver as the sun began to dip below the jagged mountain peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. With a calm, deliberate motion, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my personal cellular phone, held down the power button, and watched the screen fade to permanent black. I tossed the useless piece of plastic onto the kitchen island. My part in his tragic play was officially over. I took a slow sip of my wine and let the absolute peace of liberation wash over my entire soul. Across town, at that exact moment, Julian was drowning in his own manufactured delusion. He was throwing a loud, obnoxious celebration at our old house with his usual crowd of sycophants and shallow party friends. The heavy bass of the club music vibrated violently through the hardwood floorboards. He was aggressively popping bottles of cheap champagne, splashing the sticky liquid onto the kitchen counters, and loudly boasting to anyone who would listen about his imminent real estate triumph. He bragged about how he was about to finalize the sale of the house by the end of the month, secure a massive influx of cash, and launch his next brilliant business venture. He even went so far as to tell his friends how he had masterfully outsmarted his supposedly useless, gullible wife into signing away her rights. Standing right by his side, clinging tightly to his arm, was his newest mistress. She was a younger woman, wearing far too much heavy perfume and a triumphant, greedy smirk, fully believing she had successfully secured a wealthy, successful entrepreneur for herself. Julian was holding court in the center of the living room, completely intoxicated by his own arrogance and the loud cheers of his friends, entirely oblivious to the heavy, deliberate footsteps marching in unison up his front porch. The loud, authoritative pounding on the heavy wooden front door cut entirely through the thumping music like a knife. When Julian swaggered over and yanked the door open, expecting yet another late-arriving guest carrying more alcohol, he was met instead by a wall of cold, unsmiling professionals. My high-profile attorney stood firmly on the porch, flanked securely by 2 uniformed county enforcement officers and an official corporate representative from the very debt collection agency I secretly controlled. The music was abruptly shut off by a confused guest. The crowded room fell dead silent. the sudden quiet hanging heavily in the air. The lead enforcement officer stepped forward and formally announced that they were executing an immediate, court-ordered asset seizure and property foreclosure due to his massive, defaulted commercial loans and total financial insolvency. Julian actually laughed out loud. He scoffed dismissively, looking back over his shoulder at his silent friends as if this was all a hilarious, easily resolvable clerical error. He arrogantly told the officers to wait right there while he retrieved the ultimate legal proof of his control. He marched aggressively over to his study, grabbed the documents off his desk, and proudly marched back, practically shoving the thick folder right into my lawyer's chest. He smugly declared that he held the sole power of attorney, that the house was already under a lucrative sales contract, and that they had absolutely no legal jurisdiction over his private property. My attorney did not flinch. He slowly opened the folder, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and offered a cold, pitying smile. "Mr. Sutherland," he said, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority, "you are severely mistaken. This document is not a property authorization. You signed a comprehensive divorce decree. You have legally accepted sole individual responsibility for hundreds of thousands of dollars in private debt, and you have entirely forfeited your rights to this property. You are completely bankrupt, and this house no longer belongs to you." The color drained entirely out of Julian's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The smug, triumphant sneer melted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror as his brain finally processed the massive magnitude of his own catastrophic mistake. He frantically snatched the papers back, his eyes darting wildly over the bold print situated right above his own hastily scribbled signature. The crushing reality of his absolute financial ruin crashed down on him like a falling concrete wall. The moment his mistress heard the words, massive debt and total bankruptcy, her triumphant smirk completely vanished. She quietly grabbed her designer leather purse from the sofa, slipped discreetly past the broad shoulders of the enforcement officers, and practically sprinted down the driveway toward her car without saying a single goodbye. His loyal friends, the exact same men who had just been drinking his champagne and loudly cheering his supposed genius, suddenly began muttering pathetic, transparent excuses. One man murmured something about an urgent family emergency, while another suddenly remembered he had to pick up his children from soccer practice. They awkwardly shuffled toward the exit, staring firmly at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with him, abandoning him to the rapidly sinking ship. Within 10 short minutes, the house was entirely empty of guests. The stern officers began firmly directing a trembling, hyperventilating Julian out onto the cold front lawn, forcing him to leave with nothing but a single, small canvas duffel bag of his personal clothes. They systematically locked the heavy wooden doors and placed bright neon legal seizure notices directly across the front glass windows. Julian was left standing completely alone on the cold suburban sidewalk, entirely stripped of his wealth, his comfortable home, his massive pride, and his entire audience. Throughout that entire, agonizing night, he desperately dialed my phone number hundreds of times. He paced the dark streets like a madman, listening to the automated voicemail greeting over and over again, begging, pleading, and screaming useless apologies into the receiver. But miles away, high up in the sky, I was completely unreachable, fast asleep in my luxurious new bed, entirely undisturbed by the pathetic, endless dialing tones ringing out into the dark void. 6 months passed since the day the heavy wooden doors of my former prison slammed shut for the final time. My life in Denver had blossomed into something entirely unrecognizable and absolutely magnificent. I was no longer merely a regional vice president. After completely revolutionizing the Western supply chain, the board of directors promoted me to head the largest and most profitable branch of Zenith Logistics in the entire country. I spent my days directing massive corporate operations from a beautiful corner office, making decisions that moved millions of dollars across international borders. The anxiety that used to choke me every single day was entirely gone. replaced by a profound, unshakable confidence. I had built an empire from the ashes of my broken marriage, and I was thriving. On a crisp, bright Tuesday morning, I decided to take a brief break from the corporate headquarters. I walked down the busy street to a small, upscale coffee shop nestled just 2 blocks away from my office tower. I was wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal gray designer suit, sipping a carefully crafted dark roast coffee, and quietly reviewing a quarterly financial report on my tablet. The bell above the glass door chimed, signaling another customer entering the warm cafe. I did not look up immediately. It was only when I heard a sudden, sharp gasp, followed by the heavy thud of a cardboard box hitting the wooden floor, that my attention was drawn away from the glowing screen. Standing just a few feet away from my small corner table was Julian. The sheer physical transformation was staggering. He was entirely stripped of the arrogant, flashy veneer he used to wear like a weapon. His expensive haircuts and imported silk ties were completely gone. Instead, he was drowning in a faded, ill-fitting brown uniform of a local parcel delivery service. His face was deeply lined with heavy exhaustion. His skin looked pale and sallow, and his shoulders were slumped forward as if he was physically carrying the massive, crushing weight of his catastrophic failures. The man who once lounged on an expensive leather sofa, mocking my ambition and demanding I serve him, was now hauling heavy boxes through the freezing city streets just to survive. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at me with wide, completely hollow eyes. A deep, agonizing flush of pure humiliation crept up his neck and stained his cheeks. He awkwardly wiped his dirty hands on his uniform trousers and took a slow, hesitant step toward my table. "Alyssa," he whispered, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate fragility. He did not possess an ounce of his former cruel confidence. He practically collapsed into the empty chair across from me without being invited. The moment he sat down, the tears began to fall. Real, heavy tears of total desperation streamed down his face. Dropping onto the collar of his cheap uniform, he began to frantically beg, pouring out a massive flood of desperate apologies. "Please," he sobbed, his hands shaking violently as he reached across the table. Trying to grasp my arm, I smoothly pulled my hand back, resting it securely on my tablet. "Please, Alyssa, you have to help me. I have lost absolutely everything. The investors took everything I owned. I am living in a tiny, freezing room, working 12 hours a day just to eat. I was so incredibly wrong. I was stupid, and I was blind." He leaned closer, attempting to use the exact same emotional manipulation he had weaponized against me for years. "You are the only good thing that ever happened to me. You are the only person who ever truly understood me. My life has absolutely no meaning without you. Please, just give me one more chance. Let me show you I can change. We can start over. I need you." I sat perfectly still, letting his pathetic, sniveling words hang in the air. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel angry. I felt absolutely nothing for him. I calmly turned off my tablet screen and slipped it into my leather tote. I reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and placed it neatly on the table to cover the cost of my drink. I stood up slowly, towering over him, and carefully adjusted the collar of my expensive designer vest. I looked down into his red, weeping eyes, holding his gaze with absolute, freezing indifference. "Every time I look at you," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and echoing with finality, "I honestly ask myself why I ever chose you." Julian froze entirely. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp gasp as he recognized his exact, venomous words from that dark winter night, thrown right back into his face. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. He sat completely paralyzed in his chair, completely destroyed by the undeniable truth of his own worthlessness. I turned my back on him and walked out of the coffee shop with my head held high. The cold morning air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I stepped up to the curb where my sleek black luxury sedan was waiting. The driver opened the heavy door for me, and I slipped into the warm, quiet interior. leaving Julian behind in the dust to rot in the miserable hell he created for himself. I looked out the tinted window as the car pulled away, accelerating smoothly toward my beautiful, brilliant, and entirely independent future. Thank you so incredibly much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey and found it satisfying, please consider supporting our hardworking team with a simple $1 donation. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the direct PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support ensures our staff can provide for their families and allows us to continue creating and bringing you these powerful stories. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.